12,000 feet over Hanoi's northern approaches. An F-105F Thunderchief breaks formation and dives toward the exact coordinates, broadcasting the fan song radar that has just locked onto the strike package, carrying a missile designed to ride that beam straight back to its source. The problem arrived in the skies over North Vietnam during the summer of 1965 with mathematical clarity. Soviet SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles began appearing around Hanoi and Haiphong in numbers that transformed the operational calculus for every strike mission crossing the Red River. Each site fielded 6 launcher rails in a star pattern, guided by a central fan song radar. The missiles climbed above 60,000 feet and carried warheads that could shred an aircraft across a lethal radius, measured in hundreds of feet. By late 1965, intelligence estimates varied, but analysts counted at least 50 sites protecting Hanoi and Haiphong, enough to turn the approaches into a layered minefield of radar and steel. American doctrine had no ready answer. Strategic Air Command's high-altitude bombing campaigns assumed either air superiority or acceptance of attrition rates incompatible with limited war. Tactical Air Command's fighter bombers had trained for low-level nuclear delivery or close air support against ground forces, not penetration of integrated air defense networks, combining radar-guided missiles with massed anti-aircraft artillery. The F-105 Thunderchief, designed as a supersonic nuclear strike aircraft, now found itself tasked with conventional bombing through defenses that forced constant maneuvering between 12,000 and 18,000 feet. The altitude band, where SAMs remained effective, but AAA fire could still reach with deadly accuracy. The initial response followed established suppression doctrine. Iron Hand flights, typically F-105D single-seaters carrying conventional bombs, attempted to locate and destroy SAM sites before they could engage the main strike force. The tactic produced minimal results. Fan song radars operated intermittently, radiating only long enough to guide a missile before shutting down and relocating. Visual acquisition of camouflaged sites in the karst landscape north of Hanoi proved nearly impossible from cockpit altitude. Even when pilots spotted a site, the 6-second exposure for accurate bombing often coincided with missile launch. By autumn 1965, loss rates on missions into Route Package 6, the heavily defended area around Hanoi, approached levels that threatened to exhaust available aircraft and crews before achieving meaningful strategic effect. What the Air Force needed was a platform that could detect SAM radars at operationally useful ranges, survive long enough in the threat environment to localize the emission source, and deliver a weapon capable of destroying the radar without requiring visual acquisition or extended straight and level flight. No such system existed in the inventory. The technology for passive radar detection had matured during the late 1950s, yielding equipment like the APR-25 launch warning receiver that could alert crews to fan song illumination. Converting that warning into targeting information required additional receivers, processing equipment, and most critically, a weapon that could home on radar emissions across the frequency bands used by Soviet fire control systems. The AGM-45 Shrike emerged from a Naval Air Systems Command program initiated in 1963 before the Vietnam escalation made anti-radiation missiles an urgent operational requirement. Developed by the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake, the missile adapted the airframe and rocket motor of the AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air weapon, replacing the radar seeker with a passive receiver tuned to specific threat frequencies. Maximum range reached approximately 10 miles under ideal conditions, but crews typically fired inside 7 miles to ensure the seeker could track the signal all the way to impact. The warhead carried 66 pounds of explosive, enough to wreck radar antennas, but not enough to guarantee the entire site went down if the hit landed on peripheral equipment. Shrike's limitations reflected the compressed development timeline and immature state of anti-radiation technology. Each missile carried a seeker head tuned to a narrow frequency band, requiring crews to select the correct variant for the expected threat before takeoff. Once launched, The missile flew a proportional navigation profile toward the radiation source. But if the radar ceased transmitting during flight, Shrike simply continued on its last computed heading until fuel exhaustion or ground impact. The weapon possessed no memory function, no ability to reacquire a target that had shut down, and no capacity to discriminate between the intended fire control radar and other emitters operating on similar frequencies. Wild Weasel emerged as a program designation in late 1965, when Tactical Air Command established a test unit at Eglin Air Force Base to validate the concept of dedicated SAM suppression using the F-100F Super Sabre. The two-seat configuration proved essential, distributing the workload between a pilot handling aircraft control and tactical maneuvering, and an electronic warfare officer managing the receiver suite and weapon employment. Early test flights demonstrated both the feasibility and the danger inherent in the mission. Effective Shrike employment required crews to fly toward the threat until achieving adequate signal strength and launch parameters, a profile that placed the aircraft well inside the SAM engagement envelope. The F-100F lacked the speed and payload capacity for sustained operations over North Vietnam. By early 1966, the program transitioned to the F-105F, a two-seat trainer variant of the Thunder Chief that could match the performance of the single-seat strike aircraft while carrying the additional equipment required for the Wild Weasel role. Modification added the Vector IV integration, combining launch warning receivers with a panoramic scanner that provided bearing information across threat frequencies. A cockpit display showed the EWO, the azimuth, and approximate range to detected emitters, though the system could not determine altitude or provide the precision coordinates needed for conventional bombing. The first operational Wild Weasel detachment arrived at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base in late May 1966, designated the 13th Tactical Fighter Squadron's Wild Weasel flight. 4 F-105F aircraft and 8 crews began flying missions into Route Package 6, initially as pathfinders for Iron Hand flights, but increasingly as hunter-killer teams employing Shrike against active SAM sites. The tactical concept placed Wild Weasels ahead of the main strike package, forcing North Vietnamese radar operators into an impossible choice: radiate and accept Shrike attack, or remain silent and allow the bombers to proceed unmolested to their targets. The reality proved more complex than the concept suggested. Fan song operators quickly learned to radiate in brief bursts, providing enough guidance for missile launch while minimizing exposure time to Shrike. Sites often operated in pairs or larger groups, with one radar illuminating the target while others remained silent in reserve, ready to assume guidance if the active radar shut down. The North Vietnamese also deployed decoy transmitters and false sights, forcing Wild Weasel crews to expend missiles against targets that posed no actual threat. Most significantly, the SAM sites existed within a layered defense that included hundreds of anti-aircraft artillery pieces ranging from 23 mm to 100 mm caliber, creating a gauntlet of fire that any suppression aircraft had to penetrate before reaching Shrike launch parameters. Standard Wild Weasel tactics evolved through the summer of 1966 as crews accumulated experience and casualties. The typical profile began at 18,000 feet, high enough to avoid most AAA, low enough to keep speed for maneuvering. The EWO monitored the receivers, calling out threats while the pilot held formation. When a fansong radar lit up, the Wild Weasel broke away and turned toward the threat, accelerating to 550 knots in a shallow dive. Launch parameters for Shrike required the target radar to radiate continuously for approximately 15 to 20 seconds, providing stable signal strength above a minimum threshold, while the missile's seeker head locked onto the emission. During this interval, the F-105F presented an ideal target for the very SAM system it intended to suppress. North Vietnamese operators learned to hold fire until the Wild Weasel committed to its attack run, then launched 2 or 3 missiles in rapid succession, forcing the crew to choose between completing the Shrike employment or breaking off to evade the incoming SAMs. The white smoke trails of SA-2 launches became the defining visual signature of missions into Route Package 6, often appearing simultaneously from multiple sites as the defense network coordinated its response. The first confirmed Shrike kill occurred on June 12, 1966, when a Wild Weasel crew destroyed a Fan Song radar northwest of Hanoi. The mission followed the emerging pattern: ingress with a strike package targeting the Yen Bai Railroad Yard, SAM launch warning at approximately 40 miles from the target, and immediate Wild Weasel response toward the threat bearing. The pilot pushed the throttle forward and descended to 15,000 feet, accepting increased AAA exposure to improve Shrike range and probability of hit. The EWO called signal strength increasing as the F-105F closed inside 10 miles. Then lock-on as the seeker head acquired the Fan Song frequency. Shrike launch occurred at approximately 8 miles slant range, the missile accelerating off the inboard pylon and tracking toward the radiation source. The pilot immediately broke hard left and pulled 4 Gs, trading altitude for airspeed, while the EWO watched for SAM launches. The Fan Song continued radiating for another 6 seconds long enough. Shrike impacted approximately 12 seconds after launch, just as the radar ceased transmission. Post-strike reconnaissance confirmed destruction of radar equipment at the coordinates corresponding to the EWO's bearing data. The site remained inactive for the following 72 hours, forcing North Vietnamese air defense to reposition assets and creating a temporary gap in SAM coverage northwest of the capital. What followed transformed the air war over North Vietnam into a contest of adaptation and counter-adaptation that played out at 500 knots and 15,000 feet. Wild Weasel crews developed techniques to maximize Shrike effectiveness while minimizing exposure time inside the SAM engagement envelope. The standard 4-ship formation evolved into hunter-killer teams, with 2 F-105Fs carrying Shrike paired with 2 F-105Ds loaded with cluster bombs for site attack after radar suppression. The Weasels would provoke SAM launches, forcing sites to radiate while simultaneously employing Shrike, then mark the location for the bomb-carrying aircraft to complete the destruction. North Vietnamese responses escalated in parallel. SAM battalions began operating with greater mobility, relocating launchers and radar equipment to complicate American targeting. Fire discipline improved, with operators learning to distinguish between genuine strike packages requiring engagement and Wild Weasel bait flights attempting to provoke radiation. The introduction of barrage firing techniques, launching multiple missiles with minimal radar exposure, reduced Fan Song transmission time while still forcing American aircraft into defensive maneuvering that disrupted attack profiles, increased fuel consumption. The technical limitations of early anti-radiation warfare became apparent through operational experience. Shrike's narrow-frequency tuning meant crews had to predict which radar variant they would encounter before takeoff, selecting missile loads from available inventory. The SA-2 system employed multiple Fan Song models operating across different frequency bands, and North Vietnamese forces also fielded fire-can radars for AAA direction and various early warning systems. A Wild Weasel loaded with Shrike variants optimized for one threat frequency might find itself facing a different emitter with no effective weapon available. Range limitations imposed additional constraints. 10 miles represented maximum kinematic range under ideal conditions with a continuously radiating target. Practical employment typically occurred inside 7 miles to ensure adequate signal strength and time of flight short enough that the radar remained active until impact. This requirement placed Wild Weasel aircraft well inside the SA-2 engagement envelope, which extended to approximately 15 miles for targets at medium altitude. They had to get close enough that the radar could kill them, but also close enough that Shrike could see the signal clearly. The result was a tactical geometry that guaranteed mutual exposure during the critical seconds of weapon employment. But the most significant limitation emerged from Shrike's lack of memory or autonomous guidance after radar shutdown. North Vietnamese operators learned to radiate just long enough to guide their own missiles toward American aircraft, then cease transmission before Shrike impact. The anti-radiation missile would continue toward the last known bearing, often impacting hundreds of feet from the now silent radar equipment. This cat-and-mouse game forced Wild Weasel crews to time their launches with precision, attempting to release Shrike late enough in the SAM engagement sequence that the fan song could not shut down before missile impact, but early enough to allow the F-105F time to evade the incoming SA-2. The workload in the rear cockpit during these engagements exceeded anything anticipated during training. The EWO monitored multiple receiver systems simultaneously, launched warning receivers for different SAM frequency bands, the panoramic scanner for bearing information and signal strength, and the radar warning receiver that provided azimuth data for display on the cockpit scope. Verbal communication with the pilot had to convey threat priority, recommended heading changes, and weapon employment timing, while the aircraft maneuvered violently and both crew members experienced G-loading that made even simple tasks physically demanding. The decision cycle, from initial detection to Shrike, launch typically compressed into 30 to 45 seconds, with no opportunity for extended analysis or consultation. Crews described the sensation as flying into a thunderstorm where the lightning aimed back. Every second inside the SAM envelope meant another chance for something to go wrong. A radar operator faster than expected, a missile salvo timed to catch the Weasel mid-turn, or simply the wrong frequency loaded on the Shrike pylon. The best teams learned to trust each other's instincts, the pilot responding to the EWO's calls before conscious thought, the EWO filtering threat priorities while his vision grayed under G-loading. The summer of 1966 saw Wild Weasel tactics mature through brutal trial and error. Crews learned to exploit the terrain, using the karst ridges northwest of Hanoi to mask their approach until achieving favorable geometry for Shrike employment. They developed coordination procedures with strike packages, timing their SAM suppression to coincide with bomber runs and create windows of reduced threat during the most vulnerable phases of target attack. The introduction of chaff corridors, with F-4 Phantom flights dropping radar-reflective material to create false targets and clutter enemy scopes, added another layer to the increasingly complex electromagnetic battle. Loss rates told the story of an evolving threat environment. Through June and July 1966, approximately one Wild Weasel aircraft was lost for every 40 to 50 sorties into Route Package 6, a rate significantly higher than standard strike missions but lower than initial Iron Hand operations. Most losses resulted from AAA rather than SAMs, a consequence of the low-altitude maneuvering required for effective Shrike employment. The 37mm and 57mm guns defending approaches to major targets created a shell density that made evasion as much a matter of luck as skill, and the F-105's large size made it an easier target than the smaller F-4 Phantom. Then the operational tempo increased. Rolling Thunder strike packages grew larger and more frequent as 1966 progressed, with daily missions against petroleum storage, transportation infrastructure, and industrial targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. Wild Weasel flights found themselves tasked for multiple sorties per day, often with minimal turnaround time between missions. Maintenance crews worked through the night to repair battle damage and restore aircraft to mission-capable status. The Vector 4 electronic warfare suite proved temperamental in the tropical environment, with humidity and temperature extremes causing frequent failures that grounded aircraft until technicians could isolate and repair the malfunctioning components. The North Vietnamese air defense network continued to expand. By August 1966, intelligence estimates suggested the number of known and suspected SAM sites had surged to over 150 in various stages of activation. The sites concentrated around Hanoi in 3 defensive rings: an inner belt within 10 miles of the city center, a middle ring extending to 25 miles, and an outer screen positioned to engage strike packages during ingress and egress. This layered deployment forced Wild Weasel crews to suppress multiple sites during a single mission, expending their limited Shrike loads against the most immediate threats, while accepting risk from sites that remained active but outside effective engagement range. Mid-August 1966, the target was the Hanoi Railroad Yard, a critical transshipment point where supplies arriving from China transferred to trucks for distribution south. The strike package consisted of 16 F-105D Thunder Chiefs carrying 750-pound bombs, escorted by 4 F-4C Phantoms from MiG Combat Air Patrol, and preceded by 2 Wild Weasel F-105Fs. Time over target fell in early afternoon, chosen for maximum sun angle and post-strike reconnaissance light. The lead Wild Weasel carried 4 Shrike missiles, 2 tuned to the primary fan song frequency used by most SA-2 sites around Hanoi, and 2 optimized for the alternate frequency that had appeared with increasing regularity during recent missions. The secondary Weasel carried an identical load. Both aircraft also mounted 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles for self-defense against MiGs, though employment doctrine emphasized survival and mission completion over aerial combat. Ingress followed the standard route, feet dry south of Haiphong, then northwest toward the Red River Valley at 18,000 feet. The EWO's receivers picked up early warning radars well before Hanoi came into range, the familiar signatures of spoon rest and bar lock systems that provided the air defense network with initial detection and tracking. These radars operated continuously and posed no direct threat, but their presence confirmed that North Vietnamese controllers were aware of the incoming strike package and positioning SAM batteries for engagement. The first fan song lit up over 40 miles out. The EWO called the bearing northeast, signal strength building fast. The pilot pushed the throttle forward and turned toward the threat, accelerating while holding altitude. The tactical geometry was unfavorable. The SAM site sat almost directly on the ingress route, positioned to engage the strike package during the vulnerable run-in to the target. Suppressing this site was not optional. At 35 miles from target, the fan song transitioned from search to track mode, the signal character changing as the radar narrowed its beam and increased pulse repetition frequency. The EWO confirmed lock-on, meaning the site had selected the Weasel as its target and was computing firing solutions. The pilot continued the intercept heading, watching airspeed build as the F-105F descended slightly to optimize Shrike range. The distance to the threat bearing decreased steadily. Then the white smoke trail appeared, rising from the jungle canopy. A second trail followed 3 seconds later, both missiles accelerating rapidly and arcing toward the intercept point. The EWO called SAM launches and began the countdown for Shrike employment, his voice steady despite the immediate threat. The pilot held heading for another 4 seconds, allowing the range to decrease to approximately 8 miles, then pickled off the first Shrike. The missile dropped clear, motor ignited, and tracked toward the fan song emission. The pilot broke hard right and pulled 5 Gs. The F-105F rolling inverted as he traded altitude for airspeed and maneuvering energy. The first SA-2 passed approximately 1,000 feet behind the aircraft, its proximity fuse failing to detonate. The second missile adjusted trajectory and continued tracking, forcing the pilot into a descending spiral that brought the Thunder Chief down through 12,000 feet. The EWO lost sight of the SAM in the turn but felt no impact, and after 6 seconds, the pilot rolled wings level and began climbing back toward mission altitude. The fan song had ceased radiating. The EWO's scope showed no signal on the primary frequency, and the Shrike had impacted somewhere in the area where the SAM launches originated. But whether the missile had destroyed the radar or simply forced it offline remained unknown. The pilot turned back toward the strike package route, checking fuel state and confirming that the secondary Weasel remained in formation. The mission continued. What happened next demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of early Wild Weasel tactics. As the strike package approached 25 miles from target, 3 separate Fansong radars activated simultaneously, creating a coordinated engagement from multiple azimuths. The 2 Weasels split to address different threats, each aircraft employing Shrike against the nearest radiating site. The suppression succeeded in forcing 2 sites offline, but the third continued tracking and launched 4 missiles in rapid succession against the lead element of F-105D bombers. The strike aircraft executed defensive maneuvers, breaking formation and descending while dispensing chaff to create false radar returns. One F-105D took battle damage from an SA-2 proximity detonation, losing hydraulic pressure and aborting the mission. The remaining bombers pressed through to the target, delivering their ordnance through intense AAA fire that filled the sky with black bursts between 10,000 and 15,000 feet. Post-strike reconnaissance confirmed significant damage to railroad infrastructure, but the cost included 1 aircraft lost to ground fire during egress and 2 more returning with damage requiring extensive repair. The mid-August mission crystallized the operational reality of Wild Weasel employment. Shrike provided a genuine capability to suppress SAM radars, forcing sites offline and creating windows for strike aircraft to reach their targets. But the weapon's limitations, the density of North Vietnamese defenses, and the tactical requirement to penetrate deep into the threat envelope meant that suppression remained a high-risk mission with no guarantee of complete success. The equation had shifted in favor of the attackers, but only marginally, and only through the willingness of Wild Weasel crews to accept danger that exceeded anything else in the tactical aviation inventory. By autumn 1966, Wild Weasel operations had established themselves as an essential component of strike packages targeting defended areas in Route Package 6. The number of dedicated suppression aircraft increased as additional F-105F aircraft received Vector 4 modifications, and crews completed training at Nellis Air Force Base before deploying to Thailand. Tactics continued to evolve, with hunter-killer teams refining their coordination and developing techniques to maximize Shrike effectiveness against an increasingly sophisticated defense network. The North Vietnamese adapted in parallel. SAM battalions improved their mobility, reducing the time required to displace and relocate. This increased tempo complicated American intelligence efforts to maintain accurate site locations and forced Wild Weasel crews to rely more heavily on real-time detection and engagement rather than pre-planned suppression of known positions. SAM operators experimented with reduced emission techniques, including brief radar bursts, and reliance on external cueing from early warning networks, trading guidance precision for reduced exposure to Shrike. The technical evolution of anti-radiation warfare accelerated through late 1966 and into 1967. Improved Shrike variants entered service with broader frequency coverage and enhanced seeker sensitivity, reducing the number of different missile types required to address the threat spectrum. The AGM-78 Standard Arm began development as a longer-range successor to Shrike, promising engagement ranges beyond 15 miles and a larger warhead capable of destroying hardened radar equipment. But these improvements remained months or years from operational deployment, and Wild Weasel crews continued flying with the original Shrike and first-generation receiver equipment. The human cost mounted steadily. Wild Weasel losses through the end of 1966 totaled 11 aircraft and 22 crew members killed, captured, or missing. The casualty rate per sortie exceeded that of standard strike missions by a factor of approximately 2, reflecting the inherent danger of deliberately flying toward active SAM sites and remaining within the threat envelope long enough to employ weapons. The Air Force struggled to maintain adequate crew strength, with the training pipeline producing new Wild Weasel teams at a rate barely sufficient to replace combat losses and normal rotation schedules. Crews rotated home after 100 missions over North Vietnam, a threshold that represented survival as much as completion of duty. Some EWOs and pilots flew together for their entire tour, developing the wordless coordination that made the difference between mission success and a smoking hole in the jungle. Others cycled through multiple partners, as casualties and reassignments broke up established teams. The psychological burden of the mission profile, deliberately provoking enemy fire, accepting exposure that other crews avoided, watching Shrike aircraft reach their targets because the Weasels had drawn the SAMs, created stresses that no amount of training could fully prepare crews to handle. Then came the operational pause. In late December 1966, President Johnson ordered a temporary halt to bombing north of the 20th parallel, creating a de facto sanctuary around Hanoi and Haiphong. The pause lasted through early February 1967, providing both sides an opportunity to reconstitute forces and refine tactics. For Wild Weasel units, the stand-down allowed maintenance crews to catch up on deferred repairs and modifications, while air crews absorbed lessons learned from 6 months of combat operations. The North Vietnamese used the pause to dramatically expand their air defense network. When Rolling Thunder resumed in February 1967, intelligence estimates suggested the number of sites had more than doubled, with over 250 positions identified in various stages of construction or activation. The sites deployed in greater depth, with multiple defensive belts extending 40 to 50 miles from Hanoi. AAA density increased in parallel, with new 85mm and 100mm batteries positioned to cover the altitude bands where aircraft maneuvered to avoid SAMs. The spring 1967 campaign demonstrated the maturation of Wild Weasel tactics and the persistent challenges of SAM suppression. Missions into Route Package 6 now routinely included 4 to 6 dedicated suppression aircraft, operating in coordinated teams that could address multiple simultaneous threats. The introduction of improved electronic warfare pods on F-105D Shrike aircraft provided additional jamming support, degrading SAM radar effectiveness and forcing North Vietnamese operators to radiate longer to achieve tracking solutions. But the fundamental tactical equation remained unchanged. Effective Shrike employment required Wild Weasel aircraft to penetrate inside 10 miles of active SAM sites, accepting exposure to both missiles and AAA during the critical seconds of weapon launch. The North Vietnamese continued to improve their tactics, employing decoys and false sights to waste American missiles while protecting genuine launchers with increasingly sophisticated camouflage and revetments. The result was a grinding attrition campaign in which neither side achieved decisive advantage and success measured in terms of strike packages reaching their targets, rather than comprehensive suppression of enemy defenses. One technical innovation emerged from the accumulated combat experience: the development of standardized threat response procedures that reduced crew workload and improved coordination. Wild Weasel teams established priority matrices for addressing multiple, simultaneous threats, focusing suppression efforts on sites with the best geometry to engage the strike package while accepting risk from more distant emitters. The procedures incorporated fuel state management, ensuring that suppression aircraft retained sufficient reserves to complete their mission and return to base even after extended maneuvering in the target area. The EWO's role evolved from pure threat detection to tactical management of the electronic battle. Experienced backseaters learned to distinguish between genuine SAM sites and decoys based on subtle differences in radar operating characteristics, conserving Shrike missiles for high-value targets. They developed techniques for exploiting terrain masking, guiding pilots into valleys and behind ridgelines that blocked radar line of sight, while maintaining adequate altitude for weapon employment. The best crews operated with minimal verbal communication, the EWO providing bearing and range information, while the pilot executed the tactical maneuvering required to achieve launch parameters. The final validation of Wild Weasel doctrine came during the intensive campaigns of late 1967. Operation Rolling Thunder reached its peak tempo in October and November, with daily strike packages of 30 to 40 aircraft targeting bridges, rail yards, and industrial facilities throughout Route Package 6. Wild Weasel flights flew multiple sorties per day, often with minimal turnaround time between missions. The operational tempo strained both equipment and crews, But it also demonstrated that dedicated SAM suppression had become an indispensable component of American air operations over North Vietnam. Loss rates told a complex story. Overall attrition for strike packages with Wild Weasel support averaged approximately 1% per sortie through late 1967, compared to 3 to 4% for missions without dedicated suppression. The difference represented hundreds of aircraft and crew members preserved through the willingness of Wild Weasel teams to accept disproportionate risk. But the suppression aircraft themselves continued to suffer casualties at rates 2 to 3 times higher than standard strike missions. A persistent reminder that the technology and tactics of 1966 and 67 remained interim solutions to a problem that would require years of development to fully address. The legacy of early Wild Weasel operations extended far beyond the immediate tactical results achieved over North Vietnam. The concept of dedicated suppression aircraft employing anti-radiation missiles became foundational doctrine for every subsequent conflict involving integrated air defenses. The F-4G Wild Weasel that emerged in the 1970s, the EA-6B Prowler, and eventually the F-16CJ and EA-18G Growler all trace their lineage directly to those first F-105F crews who flew into the SAM rings around Hanoi with primitive equipment and untested tactics. The technical evolution continued through decades of development. Modern anti-radiation missiles like the AGM-88 HARM possess range, speed, and guidance capabilities that would have seemed impossible to the crews flying Shrike in 1966. Contemporary electronic warfare systems provide comprehensive threat detection, identification, and prioritization with processing power millions of times greater than the Vector IV suite. But the fundamental tactical challenge remains unchanged. Suppressing enemy air defenses requires aircraft and crews willing to penetrate the threat environment, accept risk, and employ weapons against targets that are actively attempting to destroy them. The men who flew the first Wild Weasel missions understood this with absolute clarity. They developed the tactics, absorbed the losses, and proved that SAM suppression could work despite primitive technology and a learning curve measured in casualties. Their contribution to American air power doctrine exceeded the sum of individual missions or confirmed radar kills. They established that integrated air defenses could be defeated through a combination of specialized equipment, dedicated training, and aggressive tactics, transforming what had seemed an insoluble problem in 1965 into a manageable challenge by 1967. The cost was measured in aircraft lost, crews killed or captured, and the psychological burden of flying missions where survival often depended on factors beyond pilot skill or tactical judgment. But the alternative, accepting prohibitive losses among strike aircraft or abandoning operations against defended targets, was strategically unacceptable. Wild Weasel crews provided the capability that made continued air operations possible, and in doing so, they wrote the template for suppression of enemy air defenses that remains relevant more than 5 decades later. Stories like this remind us that war isn't just about dates and numbers. It's about people, the split-second decisions that shaped entire battles. Every flight, every firefight, every tactic is a piece of a massive puzzle where one order could decide the fate of hundreds. We bring back these forgotten moments to show that behind every report and archive page stood real men, pilots, scouts, engineers, soldiers, whose courage and ingenuity changed the course of war, even if their names were never written in textbooks. Tell us in the comments, what moment of the Vietnam War impressed you the most? Or what operation should we cover next? Your ideas keep these stories alive. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us uncover more forgotten chapters where history lives through those who fought it.